Hi everybody, my name is Andres Puente. Welcome to Dev School, and in today's video I want to talk to you guys about dependency injection in Spring, why it's important, and I will also go over 3 different examples of how dependency injection works in Spring. Now, in short, the way dependency injection works is that whenever an object is created, with dependency injection, that object receives all of its dependencies from an outside source. This is different from your traditional sense where when you're creating an object, you're basically, and let's say you have another object that you have embedded inside. When you first create the object, that object is responsible for going out and getting the references to all of its dependencies. We can actually see that here. So right now I'm in the Wikipedia page for dependency injection. And just here, we see an example of a class that doesn't use dependency injection. This class is called the client class, and inside they have an example service class. And you can see that this example service class is used during the greet method. And in order for you to use this greet method, we have to first instantiate the class, which is actually being done here in the constructor. So you can see that the client class is actually going ahead and instantiating the class before it can actually even use it. Now with dependency injection, I said the object actually receives all of its dependencies from an outside source. If you scroll down over here, you actually see 2 different examples of how dependency injection works. The way it looks is you basically just have, on the constructor side, you would just have the client constructor, and then you would have the dependency, in this case is the service class. And all you would do is you would just set the service equal to the service that's being imported or injected. You can also do it with setter methods. So you basically just have your service class, which is being passed in as a, at least in this case, it looks like it's being passed in as a parameter. And then you just set your service class in your field equal to the one that's being passed in as your parameter. So that's just a really quick explanation of how dependency injection actually works and how it's different from the traditional sense. I know it looks like it's not that impressive, but it's actually quite important, especially when you're building big applications, because what dependency injection allows you to do is to isolate classes. So what you can do, and what isolation does, and the main benefit behind isolation, is that it allows you to kind of test different components separately. Like in this case, where we're not using dependency injection, if you wanted to test the client class by itself, would it be very difficult, because you'd have to first also then instantiate the example service class. And so it can become a little bit difficult to just simply test the client class. Whereas with the dependency injection, you can actually use mocks to pass something like a service class, and then that would allow you to just test your client class in isolation. So that's really just a high-level overview about dependency injection in Spring. Now, if we go over to Eclipse, I have 3 different applications that I want to kind of go over with you guys. So there's generally 3 ways that dependency get injected in Spring. One way is using configuration files. So you will, and it's usually like an XML configuration file that lists all of your beans, which are your dependent objects. Another way is to use annotations, which are kind of like directives that you have alongside your Java code that then indicate basically that this object is either a bean, or that you should inject an object or a bean into a particular object. And then the final way that I've seen a lot of people use dependency injection is to actually use like a Java config file, and where they would like instantiate some of the beans, and it will also then indicate the properties. So in my first example here, di XML config. In this example, I've basically created an application that uses an XML configuration file. So to start off, if we go into the POM file, and then we look at the dependencies, the only really dependency we have is just on the Spring framework. By the way, these projects were developed using Maven. I haven't created a video on how to use Maven just because I know that there's a lot of videos out there on how to create Maven projects, but if you guys are interested, then just kind of drop me a note in the comment section and I can kind of put something together. So like I said, the only dependency you have, it's just your Spring dependency, which we've listed right here. Okay, and then now let's kind of go back into the actual project. Under your SRC main resources, this is your XML configuration file that lists all of your beans. A bean, like I said before, is your dependent object. This is the object that's actually going to be injected into another object. And so there, under the XML configuration, you would generally have them listed in a separate file, which is in this case I've called the apps context. And so here you basically have this is your bean right here. It has a name right here, which is called message. And then you also indicate the actual source of the class that's going to be injected. So if we go now into our domain directory, just to look at the application, it's a very simple application. You just have a message interface that only has one method, a print string, which takes in a string as a parameter. And then you have an implementation of that interface, which I've called message imp. And the only thing it has is the one method, which takes in the string, and then it outputs hello, and then the string. And then our application, which is under DevSchool app. So here we have several things. So application context. This right here, it's a class that extends the bean factory. So in my explanation, I said that with dependency injection, you have an outside source that is responsible for providing dependencies to an object. Well, in Spring, that outside source is called the bean factory. The bean factory is what's responsible for the life cycle of your dependencies. And so, and you also have actually different types of classes that implement the bean factory interface. In this case, because we're using an XML configuration file, we are using this generic XML application context so that it's able to parse that XML configuration file. Okay, so basically all you do is you have your bean factory implementation right here, and then you pass in the address of your configuration file. So app context, and here it is. And then all you do to load your bean is you basically just you use your bean factory, and it has this method called getBean. You pass in the name of the bean, and this message, if you recall, under your configuration file, you've indicated your bean, and it has a name or an ID of message. So that's kind of what we're passing in right here. And then it then returns the bean, which is if you recall, also we have a we're indicating that the class that it's going to actually return is the message interface. So basically, when you call the application context get bean, it's actually going to return the implementation of our interface, which is message imp. And then just what we do here is we just basically use the message implementation. We use the print string method, and we pass in a string. So if we run this, we should see that it just says hello, which is from our implementation, and then the string that we passed in, which is welcome to my channel. So that's just a very simple implementation of dependency injection where we're using configuration files. So in our first example, we went through a project that uses XML configuration. In this example, we're going to go over a project that doesn't use an XML configuration. It actually uses a Java file as the configuration file. So if we open up the project, it's called DI app contacts. Just briefly, let's look at the POM file, and if we look at the dependencies, we can see that nothing's changed. The only dependency that we have is on the Spring framework. Now let's open up our Java files. In terms of the, like I said, the domain, everything's the same. We have the one interface with the one method, and the implementation of that interface, which is exactly the same. Nothing's changed. Now let's look at the configuration file, because this is where the main difference lies. Here we have this one file which is called config.java. We have it annotated with this annotation that's called @configuration that tells Spring that this file is a configuration file. And we've also indicated that we have one bean. The way that we've indicated that is because we're using the bean annotation. And similar to the XML configuration, we had to give that bean a name. So in this case, we've given it the same name, and you can see it right here. It says name. And then we're returning the implementation that we want. So when this bean is called, it's going to return the message implementation class. Now let's look at our class. It's very similar to how it worked before. You have your bean factory implementation over here. You pass in your bean, or you get your bean from your configuration file, which then returns the message implementation. And then we call on the print string method from our message implementation, and then we just we pretty much just get our message. So if we run it, you can see the output is exactly the same. So in my last example, I created a project that uses annotation. So if we open up our project and we look at our POM file, we can see that nothing's really changed here. We still have that one dependency on Spring. Now here again, we are using an XML configuration file. The main difference between this configuration file and the original one that we saw in our first example is that it has this one line right here, which basically tells Spring to scan through your package, in this case com.devschool, and look for any annotations. And those annotations are either going to indicate a place where you have to either inject a bean, or it will tell Spring that a particular resource is a bean to be injected somewhere else. Okay. So let's look at our Java files. I've changed it up a little bit. Our message interface, exactly the same. Our message implementation, however, has another class embedded in it. It's called annotated. And if we look at that really quickly, the annotated class basically has a string field, and it has just one method. Now, the important thing to note here is this @service annotation. And what this basically does is it tells Spring that it's a dependency that should be injected somewhere else, okay? Now, if we go back to our message implementation, we can see here that we have a setter method that takes in the annotated class, and it pretty much sets the parameter equal to, or it sets the field equal to the parameter that's being passed. And auto-wired here, this is another Spring annotation that basically says that you should inject a dependency here. And so when this class first gets created, the way it's going to work, it's going to go ahead and it's going to see that it's auto-wired, and then it's going to go into your annotated class, and then it's going to then inject that into your message implementation. So if we now go into our app, it's basically exactly the same as our first implementation. We have our bean factory implementation. We call on the get bean method from the bean factory, and we call and we pass in the bean, which is the same as before, message, and then we call on the method. So if we run this, it says this comes first, hello, welcome to my channel. Now if we look at our message implementation, the reason why it's different is because before we return the string, we're actually calling on the method of the annotated class. So here we can see that actually our annotated class is being instantiated, and it's being instantiated correctly. So that's basically it. The three different implementations. You have your annotation. You have just the plain configuration file, which we saw in our first example, and then you also have these configuration file, which is a Java file. So if you have any questions, just let me know, and if there's anything else you want to know about dependency injection, just let me know, and I will try to put something together for you guys. So I hope you liked it. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up, and remember to subscribe.